Okay. Well, I hope you all have a great 4th of July, and I hope to see you on Sunday. We don't have a massive 4th of July exodus, but anyways, whoever's here, you're going to give them a great lesson because this is a great text with a lot of things you can discuss. But remember, with discussion, don't let it get out of hand or you don't teach the lesson. And to me, just listening to people talk and getting off track is not why we're here. So keep it in the balance, keep it under control. Um, and it's Acts chapter 4, verse 30. I'm going from the verse 34 through chapter 5, verse 14, and you'll see why I go to verse 14 when I get to the end of the video. But again, here, the theme as I see it, this is how I would put the theme of this passage, comes straight out of Galatians 6, 7. Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. Whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap. I don't think there's any greater lesson in this text than that. Yet there are other parts of that that makes this situation very unique and very interesting. On a more positive, if you want to kind of discuss a positive way to look at the theme, you could say this: when you see sin as God does, you're going to avoid his judgment, his chastisement, and experience his blessing. And so there's really usually a negative and a positive way to look at a passage. And, had Ananias and Saphira identified the sin as it was creeping into their heart, their desire to be hypocritical and to lie and to appear godlier than they were, which wasn't very godly, they would have avoided losing their lives. So again, there's a lot to say about this text. You don't want to get bogged down by the verses in chapter 4, verses 34 through 37. There's some very important things that you need to talk about, but very quickly. The curriculum, on page 70, it talks about Barnabas being a Levite, and it goes into this big paragraph about that. It's not that that's not important, but it's not important to this lesson. It's not really a major thing to harp on. And then Cyprus. I don't know why we need to know all about Cyprus for this particular lesson. Here's the problem. You've got usually 30 to 35 minutes to teach. If you try to say everything that's in the curriculum, you will not get to the important or all the important stuff, because there's important stuff, not just in the curriculum, but what I'm adding to it. And I'm adding to it for a reason, because you really should teach it. I wouldn't be saying it if I didn't think it was important. So again, context is huge, but here's the important things in those verses for context. Chapter 4, verse 34 through 37. What do your students need to be reminded of or need to realize about those verses and what they have to do with what we're going to read in chapter 5? Well, first of all, we have that reminder of the continued generosity of the church, just picturing the way people were coming together and giving generously to help those in need. And so everybody wants to get in the bandwagon, right? It's very easy in a group setting to start doing things everyone else is doing for the wrong reason. And then you see this example of Barnabas. He's singled out, I think, for two reasons. Number one is testimony of the church as a son of consolation and encourager. He was obviously providing a great example of this, and he's doing it in the context of selling land. And even though many might have been doing that, what he does is in direct contrast to Ananias and Saphira, who sold land and then sinned in how they handled it. And that's why chapter 5, verse 1 begins with the word but. Man, anytime you see, there's trigger words that ought to really get your attention. But is one of them, therefore, wherefore. You see those words and you've got to look back and say, okay, there's a contrast here, or in this case, a contrast. So you go back and you bring that out, and then, of course, you get to verse 2. The real crux of the sin is really found in verse 2. They kept back some of the price. He kept back some of the price for himself. It wasn't that he kept back some of the land. We don't know how much land he sold. But what he did sell, let's say he sold it, let's just put it in our terms, that he sold it for $20,000. Let's say he sold it for that. He's bringing, let's say, $10,000 or whatever it is, something under $20,000, and making it appear that that's the full price of the land. That's the sin. he's trying to make himself look more generous than he really is. And because of the heart, he's really not generous at all. He's giving to be seen by men. And so in your curriculum, the bottom of page 70, it references Matthew 6, 1-4. Make sure you read or have somebody read those verses, because they really are very key to this situation. Jesus says in Matthew 6:1, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people to be seen by them, for then you'll have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, which is what is happening here, sound no trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward, and that's the praise of men. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Now, some smart aleck might say, well, they're not giving in secret. Everybody's giving, and they're laying it at the apostles' feet. Well, it isn't. That was the way in which they were doing this. There was no real way to do all of this so that nobody knows about it. The point isn't that nobody knows about it. The point is that you don't want anyone to know about it. You're not trying to be seen by men. And so I'm sure when they were giving, they weren't necessarily pronouncing what they were giving or how much they were giving, but somehow Peter knew what Ananias and Saphira were doing. The text doesn't tell us how. It could be that he just knew the information, knew what the land was worth, knew what he sold, and knew what he gave. But chances are, being an apostle, Peter was giving some kind of special information, special word of knowledge, if you will, from God of what was going on. Now, the all-important question that people should ask in class, and that you can bring up as a discussion, get them to talk about it for a few minutes, get them to state why. People shouldn't just have opinions. They should have a biblical reason for their position. And I really think you should challenge people to think that way. Because God doesn't do this kind of severity all the time. He rarely does it. I mean, how many hypocrites have you known in your lifetime? How many of them were struck dead? God does chastise believers, sometimes unto death. We don't know for sure if Ananias and Saphira were true believers who just were acting hypocritically, or if they were always hypocrites. That's not really important here, although I could go on about that and make a case about which of those scenarios is probably more likely. But the point is, what made this situation so critical in the eyes of God that he felt he needed to strike them dead for their sin? Number one, it was the beginning stages of the church. Here's the church in infancy. In fact, in verse 11 of the text, it's the first time the word ecclesia is used of the new body, the church, in the book of Acts, not in the scripture, because Jesus refers to it, but in the book of Acts. Because of this, there's a need to make sure that there's severe discipline in a situation like this to prevent it from snowballing, to keep the early church understanding the importance of being holy and that God judges sin. And so basically, God is setting up an example. Homer Kent writes it this way: God's attitude towards sin was clearly revealed, and the purity of the church, of the infant church, was maintained. So the fact that the church is in its infancy here is really important. Barney Fife, you want a great theological statement and commentary on this? Here it is. Barney Fife. What does he often say to Andy? I'm not going to try to do it in a Don Knotts voice, but Andy, you got to nip it in the bud. And that's exactly what God is doing here. He's nipping hypocrisy in the bud, because this is the infancy of the church. If we want to see the church grow and expand as it does, you cannot have sin just starting to, little leavening the whole lump. And so God brings the hammer down, if you will. And what is the result of that? Notice the results from the text. Number one, great fear came upon all who witnessed and heard of this in verse 5. So the whole church, and even those that aren't believers, they see this, they hear this, they know about this. So the message is, hey, God doesn't take sin and doesn't take hypocrisy lightly. Great application here to your people. Do you take sin lightly? Do you think God takes lightly your sin? He certainly knows about it. He knows the heart, just like he knew the heart of Ananias and Saphira. And 1 Corinthians 11:30, God does sometimes chastise unto death, even today. For this cause, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 11:30, many are weak and sickly among you, and many sleep. Now, we don't have the ability to accurately say, oh, that person just had that accident because God's chastising them. That's not up for us to do. But does God chastise believers when they fail to deal with their sin? Yes, he does. And so we should have some fear about that, great fear about that as well. Remember, notice the result. Number one, great fear came upon all who witnessed. Number two, hypocrites and unbelievers decide to stay away from these people. So the church is kept pure. Look at verse 13. But none of the rest dared to associate with them. However, the people held them in high esteem. The rest are no doubt talking about the crowd, the people that saw this that weren't believers. Those that were hypocrites, those that maybe were tempted to join this group and be part of all this great stuff, but weren't really truly saved. Okay, we don't want anything to do with that church. And what happens? The church stays purer than it would have. As a pastor for 30 years, as a senior pastor for 30 years, there were times people left my church that I was very glad they left my church. And if you don't understand that, come talk to me if that offends you, but I'll explain it better. But there are some people that they're just dragging the church down by their sin and their hypocrisy, and they won't deal with it. Number three, because of all that, the Spirit then was free to continue the work, his powerful work of redemption. That's why I want to go all the way to verse 14. Look at verse 14. This is the third consequence. And seeing, that's the wrong chapter. Verse 14. And all the more believers in the Lord, multitudes of men and women were constantly added to their number. So you've got fear for the church and unbelievers, and for those hypocrite people who would be not interested in turning to the Lord, they step back, don't want anything to do with the church. But then you've got this continued freedom of the Spirit of God to draw people to himself and to redeem, again, thousands of people. And I think the implication is safe to make that had sin just flourished at this time and this hypocrisy gone unchecked, the Spirit would have been hindered. And so maybe that wouldn't have happened, at least to that degree. A lot more that can be said about this passage, but the curriculum does a good job with a lot of other stuff there, and some of this stuff they talk about, but I tried to go a little bit deeper into it, and it doesn't really deal with that question of why so severe, and I think that's a huge question. So anyways, I hope you have a great class and hope to see you on Sunday.